Imagine stepping into the most important room of your entire life.
Right, yeah.
Like maybe it's the final interview for a job you desperately need, or, you're walking into a boardroom to pitch this make or break project.
Oh, absolutely. The pressure is just immense.
Yeah, exactly. Or perhaps you're a medical student, right? And you are about to walk into a room where someone is actively dying.
Wow, yeah, that's the ultimate stakes.
Right. And you are literally the only one who can save them. I mean, your heart is just hammering against your ribs.
Your breathing gets super shallow.
Yeah, and your hands are like shaking slightly. We all know that visceral, terrifying feeling.
Yeah, we definitely do.
But what if I told you that in this exact moment, the subconscious way you frame that terror in your mind is actively, like, physically altering the blood flow inside your skull?
I mean, it is just a profound realization because,
Uh,
it moves our entire understanding of stress from a purely, like, emotional realm into a strictly mechanical structural one.
Yeah, it really does.
The way you evaluate a high-stakes moment dictates whether your brain uh, builds a network of oxygen to help you survive, or if it actively starves itself of the exact resources you need to think.
It is wild to think about. So, welcome to the deep dive. Today is Friday, May 29th, 2026.
Glad to be here.
And I want you to picture a virtual title slide flashing right in front of you. On it, we have the name of our show, today's date, and the subject of our investigation today.
Which is a really fascinating one.
It really is. It's a study by lead author Jason Betson, published in 2025. And the title reads, quote,
Oh, definitely. We are going to decipher exactly how a threat mindset versus a challenge mindset alters human performance at the cellular and, systemic level.
I love it.
We'll be looking at specific experimental conditions, the variables, brain network activity, and all the structural findings to answer this really fundamental question about human competence under fire.
I mean, think of the brain's stress response kind of like a car's engine.
Okay, I like that analogy.
Yeah, like we all face these steep, intimidating hills in life. And some people see the incline, mentally accept the challenge, smoothly shift gears, and rev the engine just enough to, accelerate up the slope.
Right, a nice smooth climb.
Exactly. But other people see that exact same hill, they completely panic, throw the car into neutral, and just redline the engine.
Oh yeah, just stomp it on the gas.
Yeah, they stomp it until the engine floods, overheats, and completely stalls out. I mean, it's the exact same engine, the exact same hill, but a completely different mechanical outcome based entirely on the driver's mindset.
I think that analogy is going to serve us very well today. Because, well, to truly understand how this biological engine functions and how it catastrophically fails, we first need to understand the environment these researchers built.
Right, they had to set the stage.
Exactly. They needed a laboratory crucible that could push human stress responses to their absolute limits, but, without putting actual human lives in danger.
Because they couldn't just give people a really hard mass test and call it a day, right? That wouldn't cut it.
No, definitely not. So they use something called OSCEs.
OSCEs, what exactly does that stand for?
OSCE stands for Objective Structured Clinical Examination. In healthcare education, and specifically in paramedicine, which this paper focuses on, these are basically the gold standard for assessment.
Okay, so it's a very big deal for these students.
Huge. Students are thrown into dynamic, high-acuity scenarios, and high acuity means severe, immediately life-threatening illness or injury.
Wow, so no pressure.
Right. They have to perform these complex clinical interventions perfectly, with the clock ticking down, all while being heavily scrutinized by assessors. Usually they're watching through a one-way mirror.
Oh man, I am sweating just thinking about it. I mean, if you've ever had a boss watch over your shoulder while you, type a simple email, just multiply that feeling by 1,000.
It's intense.
But how does a researcher even measure what is happening inside the student's mind before they even, touch the patient?
Well, this is where we delve into cognitive appraisal theory. This framework was originally developed by Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman.
Okay, Lazarus and Folkman.
Yeah, and the 2025 paper grounds its entire methodology in this concept.
Yeah.
To pull a direct quote from the study here, they write, Cognitive appraisal theory asserts that individuals engage in evaluative processes to determine whether their available coping resources are sufficient to meet the demands of a given situation.
So it's basically a rapid-fire internal math equation.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, our brains are constantly weighing the demands of the environment against what we actually has in the tank.
Precisely. And it happens in a fraction of a second. If your brain calculates that your resources, your training, your emotional regulation, your knowledge, if those are equal to or greater than the demands of the situation, You enter a challenge state.
Okay, a challenge state.
Right. And a challenge state is oriented toward promotion. It is focused on successful goal achievement, learning, and potential gains.
But if the internal math doesn't check out,
Then you enter a threat state. If the perceived demands exceed your perceived resources, your mind shifts gears straight into damage control.
which is not where you want to be.
No, it's not. A threat state is correlated with anticipated losses, poor performance, and this really defensive posture.
Wait, I have to stop you there and push back on this a little bit because something just isn't tracking for me.
What's that?
The subjects of this study are final year undergraduate paramedicine students.
Yes, that's correct.
So they have been studying for years. They are like wets away from graduation and being out in real ambulances. Technically speaking, every single one of them should have the resources to pass this test.
You would think so, yeah.
So why would a highly trained senior student appraise an exam they've prepared years for as a threat?
That is the exact paradox at the heart of this research. It highlights this vast, dangerous chasm between actual resources and perceived resources.
Oh, perceived resources.
Exactly. You can possess a massive amount of clinical knowledge encoded right there in your hippocampus. But if your cognitive appraisal mechanism misfires and convinces you that you are inadequate, your biology will blindly follow that false narrative.
That is wild.
The researchers actually reference earlier work by psychologist Jim Blaskovich to explain this. Blaskovich noted that while both a threat and a challenge state involve physiological arousal geared toward a goal, the threat state is uniquely fragile.
Fragile. Fragile in what way, exactly?
Meaning it's highly unstable and honestly biologically punishing. When you perceive a threat, your physiological response can become so overwhelming that it essentially barricades you from accessing the actual skills you possess.
Wow.
Yeah, you basically become a prisoner of your own miscalculation.
That is absolutely fascinating. The mind literally builds a wall between you and your own competence just because of a warped perception.
It really does.
I mean, think about how that applies to our everyday lives. Have you ever walked into a meeting where you knew the material perfectly, but the moment the CEO looked at you, you perceived a threat and suddenly couldn't remember your own presentation?
I think we've all been there.
Right. That is the fragility of the threat state in action.
And measuring that fragility in real time, without interrupting the life-saving simulations, requires incredible experimental design.
I bet.
Jason Betson and his team had to gather continuous, non-invasive, objective biological data while the students were actively moving around a simulated trauma room.
So how did they set up the board? Let's talk about the participants and the controls, because I read that the lengths they went to in order to ensure the data was clean are just staggering.
They really are. So they recruited 26 undergraduate paramedicine students.
Okay, 26 students.
Yes, and the cohort consisted of 14 females and 12 males. Their average age was 24.2 years. But, age and gender are just the baseline. The strict inclusion criteria are what really make this data so bulletproof.
Right, because if you're measuring cardiovascular stress responses like heart rate and blood pressure, you have to account for the fact that a person's underlying physical fitness completely changes those metrics.
Exactly. I mean, a sudden spike in heart rate means something very different for a marathon runner compared to someone with severe hypertension.
Oh, for sure.
So the researchers ensured physiological equivalence. The average body mass index, or BMI, of the participants was 24.1.
Which is pretty healthy, right?
Yes, this places the entire cohort squarely within the healthy weight range, according to World Health Organization standards.
But they didn't stop at physical health, though. They controlled for academic competence as well, didn't they?
They did. Every single participant was required to have a grade point average greater than 5.0 on whatever scale their university uses.
Why mandate high grades for a stress study? I mean, what's the point of that?
It addresses the exact pushback you brought up earlier regarding resources. By exclusively selecting high-achieving students, the researchers essentially guaranteed that every single person walking into that simulation had the actual academic and technical capability to save the patient.
Ah, I see. So if a student fails the scenario, the researchers can confidently say, well, it wasn't because they were a bad student who didn't study.
Exactly.
It was entirely because of their cognitive appraisal state. It isolates the mindset as the true catalyst for failure.
It isolates the independent variable perfectly. And to further protect that data, they excluded anyone taking central nervous system altering medications.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, so if a student was taking anti-anxiety medications, sleep aids, benzodiazepines, or beta blockers, they were completely disqualified from the study.
Beta blockers are a really big one in high-stress professions, right?
Yes, they are. Beta blockers literally block the release of adrenaline and noradrenaline in certain parts of the body, which prevents your heart rate from spiking during acute stress.
Wow. Okay.
Musicians and public speakers sometimes use them to stop hand tremors. But if you have a participant on beta blockers, you are artificially manipulating their cardiovascular dependent variables, which just ruins the entire experiment.
So we have 26 incredibly healthy, academically brilliant, unmedicated students. What kind of nightmare did the researchers subject them to?
The crucible consisted of two grueling scenarios. Scenario 1 involved a critically unwell patient experiencing severe anaphylaxis.
So a massive allergic reaction.
Yes, this requires rapid identification of a life-threatening allergic reaction and immediate administration of intramuscular epinephrine, among, other interventions.
Okay, so that's the first test, and then they brought them back for round 2.
Exactly 7 days later to the day, and crucially, at the exact same time of day to control for circadian rhythms, which can influence baseline cortisol levels.
Man, they really thought of everything.
They had to. Scenario 2 featured an unconscious patient in respiratory arrest secondary to a narcotic overdose.
So they aren't breathing.
Right, they have stopped breathing entirely, and the student has to manage the airway and push reversal agents like naloxone.
And these aren't just like 5-minute pop quizzes, are they?
No, not at all.
I learned the mannequins they use, these high-fidelity megacode Kelly simulators, can actually blink, breathe, and simulate heart rhythms. These scenarios were absolute marathons.
They really were. The average duration was 30.7 minutes, with a minimum runtime of 26.5 minutes.
Just imagine trying to sustain peak physical and mental output in a simulated life-or-death crisis for half an hour.
To map the physiological reality of those 30 minutes, the researchers categorized their variables meticulously.
Let's break those down.
Sure. So the independent variables, the factors driving the outcomes, were threefold. First, the cognitive appraisal state itself. Threat versus challenge.
How do you even measure that? You can't just pause the simulation and ask them, hey, are you feeling threatened right now?
No, you definitely can't do that.
Yeah.
They used a validated psychological instrument called the stress appraisal scale, and it was administered just before the scenario began.
Oh, okay.
Interestingly, the researchers calculated the scores after the fact. The process was completely blinded. During the simulation, neither the student nor the clinical assessor grading them knew whether the student was in a threat or a challenge group.
Well, that's smart. That prevents the assessor from unconsciously grading a nervous-looking student more harshly.
Exactly.
What were the other independent variables?
The second was the scenario iteration, so scenario 1 versus scenario 2. And the third was the specific time points within those 30-minute scenarios, which they categorized as early, mid, and late.
Okay, so those are the independent variables pulling the strings. What were the dependent variables? Like, what were they actually watching change in the students' bodies?
They cast an incredibly wide net for those. They tracked the practical outcome, which was clinical performance scores graded out of 10.
Got it.
They captured static physiological markers taken 5 minutes before and 5 minutes after the scenarios. Things like baseline blood pressure, resting heart rate, blood glucose levels, and salivary cortisol.
Salivary cortisol, so just swabbing their mouths.
Yes. And finally, they captured continuous markers throughout the entire half hour: heart rate, respiration rate, skin temperature, and sweat levels.
All of that is fascinating, but honestly, it's the final dependent variable that completely blew my mind when I was looking over this.
Oh, the brain monitoring.
Yeah. We are so used to studies measuring heart rates and stress hormones, but this study went structurally deeper. They didn't just measure the downstream effects of stress in the body. They actively monitored the brain network activity inside the students' skulls while they were trying to save the mannequin.
The neural monitoring is really the absolute centerpiece of this research. But to understand why it matters so much, we probably need a brief primer on the brain structure involved, specifically the prefrontal cortex.
Right. When I think of the prefrontal cortex, the PFC, sitting right there behind the forehead, I always think of it as the CEO of the brain.
That is a highly accurate way to look at it. The prefrontal cortex manages executive function.
Okay.
In a crisis, your ancient limbic system might be just screaming at you in fear, But the PFC is the structure that overrides that panic to engage in higher-order cognitive processes.
Like what exactly?
It is responsible for complex decision-making, novel problem-solving, planning multiple steps ahead, and prioritizing tasks.
So for a paramedic, that means synthesizing a dozen pieces of chaotic information all at once.
Exactly.
Like the patient's lips are blue, the heart rate is dropping, I need to secure an airway, but wait, do I need to push a drug first? What is the correct dosage based on their estimated weight? All of that rapid-fire logic happens in the PFC.
Yes, it does.
Bringing back our car analogy from earlier, or maybe a computer analogy here, the prefrontal cortex is your brain's RAM, your random access memory. When a computer runs a really heavy, complicated program, it draws massively on the RAM. And what happens when hardware draws more power?
Well, it requires more energy. And in the human brain, drawing more power equates to recruiting more blood flow.
Right?
When a specific region of the prefrontal cortex is activated to solve a complex problem, that neural network fires, and the body immediately rushes oxygenated blood to that localized area to fuel the firing neurons.
But how did they measure blood flow inside a conscious moving person's head? I mean, normally if you want to see brain activity, you slide someone into a massive claustrophobic MRI tube.
True.
Obviously, a paramedic can't do CPR on a patient while lying perfectly still inside a giant magnet, so how did they do it?
This is where the technological brilliance of the study really shines. They utilize something called fNIRS. That's functional near-infrared spectroscopy. It is a wearable, completely non-invasive technology.
I am so fascinated by this. Walk us through the mechanism of fNIRS.
Sure. So the participants wear this specialized band of sensors across their foreheads. And these sensors emit near-infrared light.
Just light.
Yeah. Now, near-infrared light has a very specific wavelength that allows it to safely pass through biological tissue. It goes right through the skin, the skull, and the cerebrospinal fluid, and penetrates the outermost layer of the brain, which is the cortical surface.
So it's literally shining a light directly into their brains, but what is it looking for once it's in there?
It is looking for oxygenated hemoglobin, which we abbreviate as O2HB.
O2HB, got it.
Oxygenated hemoglobin absorbs near-infrared light differently than deoxygenated hemoglobin does. By measuring how much light bounces back to the sensors, the fNIRS software can calculate the exact concentration of freshly oxygenated blood rushing into specific regional networks of the prefrontal cortex.
We call this hemodynamics, right?
Yes, exactly.
Using regional blood flow as a highly accurate proxy for neural activation. So if there is a huge spike of O2HB in the left prefrontal cortex, you know that specific area of the brain's RAM is working overtime.
Exactly. It maps network connectivity in real time. Now, a common critique of fNIRs in the scientific community is that everyone has different skull thicknesses and different tissue densities, right?
Oh, sure.
And that could theoretically skew how the light is absorbed.
Right. A 24-year-old student might have a completely different bone density than a 50-year-old. How do you standardize the light readings across different people?
The researchers utilized advanced software called OxySoft, which applies an age-adjusted formula to determine a differential path length factor.
That sounds complicated.
It is a bit. Essentially, the software uses a specific mathematical algorithm based on the participant's exact age to digitally strip away the unique thickness of their skull and tissue.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this ensures that the sensors are isolating and measuring the brain activity with pinpoint accuracy.
Okay, so the stage is officially set. We have 26 elite students. We have fNIRS sensors reading the real-time power draw of their mental RAM. We have continuous cardiovascular monitors, sweat sensors, and salivary cortisol swabs.
They are completely wired up.
They are walking into scenario 1, the anaphylaxis crisis. What happens to the biological engines of the students who appraised this scenario as a FET?
To understand the initial shock to the system in scenario 1, we really must examine the static endocrine data, specifically the stress hormone cortisol.
Okay, cortisol.
Both the threat group and the challenge group walked into the exact same room and faced the exact same medical emergency. But their internal chemistry diverged immediately, and quite violently.
I want to focus on this chemical journey for a second, because cortisol isn't just a switch that flips,
Right, it's a process. When a student in the threat group walks into that room and feels overwhelmed, their hypothalamus, this tiny region at the base of the brain, sounds an alarm. It signals the pituitary gland, which then sends a chemical messenger all the way down to the adrenal glands sitting right on top of the kidneys.
That's a long journey.
It is. And then the adrenal cortex pumps cortisol into the bloodstream.
That is the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in action. It is an ancient survival circuit. And in scenario 1, the HPA axis of the threat group went into absolute overdrive.
Really?
Oh yeah, the data shows that the threat group's salivary cortisol spiked massively. To put this in perspective regarding effect sizes, we look at the statistical significance. The p-value for the threat group's cortisol increase was 0.006.
Okay, let's translate that for anyone who hasn't taken a statistics class recently. A p-value is basically a way of measuring if a result is just a random fluke.
Exactly.
Generally, anything under 0.05 is considered significant in science. So 0.006 is massive. It means there's only a 6 in 1,000 chance that this huge cortisol spike was an accident.
It is a definitive, undeniable, biological reaction to the mindset of threat. The challenge group, conversely, saw a very minor elevation in cortisol, but with a p-value of 0.342, the researchers deemed it statistically non-significant.
Wow, what a difference.
In fact, if they removed just 2 statistical outliers from the challenge group, the average cortisol level for the challenge students might have actually decreased during the life or death simulation.
That is just staggering. The challenge students were chemically calm. But what is all that cortisol actually doing to the threatened students? I think people often hear the word cortisol and just equate it to the vague emotion of feeling stressed.
Yeah, they do.
But it is a structural mechanism, isn't it?
It is entirely structural. Cortisol actively modulates systemic vascular resistance. In layman's terms, it basically acts as a conductor for your blood vessels.
Okay.
It constricts certain pathways to forcibly redistribute blood flow throughout your entire body. One of its primary evolutionary functions is to increase cerebral perfusion.
Meaning it intentionally forces more blood up into your brain. Right, because if you are a hunter-gatherer facing down a predator, you need your sensory processing and reaction times dialed to the absolute maximum. Your body is flooding your brain with resources just to keep you alive.
Which brings us perfectly to the cardiovascular data. Because if cortisol is forcing blood around the body, the heart has to work harder to pump it.
And the monitors proved it. Both groups naturally saw jumps in their systolic blood pressure and heart rate simply from the physical exertion of the simulation, right? Doing CPR and moving around is hard work.
Yes, definitely.
But the threat group's heart rate was consistently significantly higher. Across the entire 30 minutes, the threat group's heart rate was hovering near 103 beats per minute, while the challenge group averaged around 94.
That sustained difference of nearly 9 beats per minute for half an hour represents a massive expenditure of physical energy. The engine is revving hard. But the most fascinating downstream effect of this cardiovascular shift involves the skin temperature data.
I have to admit, when I first read the outline for the study, this confused me so much.
Really? How so?
Well, the threat group is producing more stress hormones. Their hearts are beating faster, they are working harder. Logically, I assumed they would be hotter. But the continuous temperature sensors showed the exact opposite. The threat group had significantly lower skin temperatures. Why did they get colder?
This is a textbook manifestation of the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS, shifting into fight or flight mode. When acute stress triggers the SNS, it induces severe peripheral vasoconstriction.
Peripheral meaning the edges of the body, like the skin and the limbs, and vasoconstriction meaning the blood vessels shrink.
Exactly. The body literally pulls warm blood away from the surface of your skin and your extremities, routing it deep into your core organs and your major muscle groups.
So it's protecting the vital stuff.
Right. Evolutionarily, this serves 2 purposes. It fuels the muscles for running or fighting, and it pulls blood away from the skin surface so that if you are slashed by a predator's claws, you won't bleed to death as quickly.
Wow, that is incredibly dark, but makes perfect biological sense. So because the warm blood is retreating to their core to prepare for a fight that will never actually happen, their external skin temperature physically drops.
Yes.
The data showed the threat group sitting at 32.8 degrees Celsius compared to the challenge group's warmer 33.05.
So we have a picture of the threat group's physiological state in scenario 1. Cortisol is flooding the system, forcing cerebral perfusion. The heart is racing. The skin is cold due to vasoconstriction. The final piece of the puzzle is the brain network activity. What did the fNIRS sensors see when they looked into the prefrontal cortex?
This was the second major shock for me. The fNIRS data revealed that in scenario 1, the threat group actually had higher concentrations of oxygenated hemoglobin in their prefrontal cortex than the challenge group.
Yep.
The RAM was drawing more power.
It is highly counterintuitive on the surface, but deeply logical when you understand the mechanism of cortisol we just discussed. Cortisol forces cerebral perfusion. So the threat group's brains were flooded with oxygenated blood.
But wait, if their prefrontal cortex has more oxygen, doesn't that mean they're processing the medical emergency better? I mean, shouldn't more power equal better performance?
Not necessarily. Think back to your car engine analogy.
Right.
Just because you are stomping on the gas and the RPM needle is buried in the red zone doesn't mean the transmission is engaged. The threat group's brains are flooded with blood because their biological alarm systems are screaming in terror, not because they're engaging in highly efficient calculated problem solving.
Oh, I see.
To quote the paper directly on this exact phenomenon, they write, "A threat appraisal will lead to increased psychophysiological stress response," and in parentheses they specify increases in cardiorespiratory function, neurological activity, and cortisol production compared to a challenge appraisal.
So it is a state of panic-induced hyperactivation. The RAM is drawing maximum power, but it's basically just spinning the loading wheel.
Yeah,
The network connectivity is chaotic, not focused.
precisely. They are expending maximum biological effort for minimal cognitive return, which leads us to the pivotal question. If the threat group is redlining their engine in scenario 1, what happens when they have to do it all over again?
And this brings us to scenario 2. This is where the narrative shifts from biological overreaction to biological collapse.
It really does.
The researchers wait exactly 7 days. The students return to the lab. This time, the mannequin is an unconscious patient who is overdosed on narcotics.
And before the scenario even begins, the static baseline data reveals a profound shift. The threat group is already anticipating failure.
How can the researchers tell that before it even starts?
Their resting respiration rate was significantly elevated before they even stepped into the simulation room. Having endured the punishing biological cost of scenario 1, the mere anticipation of scenario 2 triggered a proactive anxiety response.
Wow.
Their breathing was rapid, their bodies were preemptively bracing for impact.
And once they got into the room, the continuous monitoring captured an incredibly visceral biological phenomenon. We talked about their skin being cold due to vasoconstriction. But in scenario 2, the sweat sensors, which measure galvanic skin response in microsiemens, showed the threat group sweating profusely.
Yes, their sweat levels were significantly higher than the challenge group, with a p-value of less than 0.001. Now, combine those two facts.
Okay.
The sympathetic nervous system is pulling warm blood away from the skin, causing a drop in temperature.
Oh.
Simultaneously, massive anxiety is activating the skin's sympathetic pathway, forcing the sweat glands to produce moisture.
Cold skin plus excessive sweat, they were in a literal cold sweat.
It is the physiological definition of a cold sweat, captured in real-time continuous data. It is a profound somatic marker of a system that is fundamentally overwhelmed by distress.
So they are hyperventilating before they start, and they are in a cold sweat while they work, but the true devastation happened in the brain, didn't it?
It absolutely did.
The fNIRS data in scenario 2 did something completely unexpected. It inverted.
It is the most critical revelation in the entire study. Remember, in scenario 1, the threat group's brains were flooded with oxygen, redlining the RAM. In scenario 2, the mean concentration of oxygenated hemoglobin across the entire 30-minute simulation plummeted for the threat group.
How dramatic was the drop?
Massive. The threat group averaged a meager 5.26 micromolar of O2-HB. Meanwhile, the challenge group, the students who maintained a positive cognitive appraisal, saw their neural activity skyrocket to an average of 9.64 micromolar. The statistical significance was absolute. Again, p less than 0.001.
So the challenge group's brain activity nearly doubled that of the threat group. Why did the threat group's brains suddenly stop drawing power? Did their prefrontal cortex just, give up?
To answer that, the researchers broke the 30-minute scenario down into specific time points to map the exact moment of failure. They created 3 junctures: early, mid, and late.
Right, so the early juncture was between 2.5 and 4.5 minutes. This is the adrenaline rush phase. They run into the room, assess the scene, and check the patient's airway.
At this early time point, the fNIRS data shows both groups looking somewhat similar. Both the threat and challenge groups experience an initial spike in regional activation as they confront the acute reality of the emergency.
But then we reach the mid-juncture between 7 and 11.5 minutes. This is where the medical intervention gets highly complex. They have to establish intravenous access, getting a needle into a vein under pressure, and they have to calculate the exact dosage of naloxone to reverse the overdose.
And this is where the paths diverge completely. For the challenge group, as the cognitive demands of the scenario increase, as they calculate dosages and execute fine motor skills, their prefrontal neural activity continues to climb significantly.
So they are rising to the occasion.
Exactly. They are smoothly shifting gears, drawing the necessary oxygen to build robust network connectivity that sustains high-level executive function.
And the threat group.
The threat group's neural activity basically flatlines. It stagnates entirely through the mid-juncture and remains suppressed all the way through the late juncture, which runs from 15.5 to 21.5 minutes. Their brains simply refuse to recruit the oxygen needed to match the rising complexity of the crisis.
What is the mechanism behind that refusal? Why does the brain just shut the door?
The researchers postulate a mechanism of profound cognitive overload. Recall the biological toll of scenario 1. They were flooded with cortisol, their hearts raced for 30 minutes, they experienced extreme peripheral vasoconstriction.
Right, they were exhausted.
They arrive at scenario 2, already depleted, hyperventilating, and trapped in a cold sweat. By the time they reach the complex mid-phase of the second scenario, they just hit a biological wall.
Their RAM didn't just overheat this time, the whole motherboard crashed.
Precisely. The paper suggests that around that midpoint, overwhelmed by the cascading demands, the threatened students likely felt they had done the bare minimum of basic management. They mentally checked out. They were biologically incapable of sustaining the high prefrontal network connectivity required to continuously problem solve.
This perfectly highlights the fragility of the threat state we discussed earlier. The threat group's overreaction in scenario 1 bankrupt their cognitive stamina for scenario 2.
Yes.
Meanwhile, let's look at the challenge group. They managed to keep their physical bodies relatively calm, no massive cortisol spikes, lower heart rates, warmer skin, but simultaneously their prefrontal cortex was firing on all cylinders, drawing massive amounts of oxygen to solve complex problems.
They decoupled their physical panic response from their cognitive output. By framing the situation as a challenge, they kept their autonomic nervous system regulated. Because their bodies weren't exhausting energy on a false fight-or-flight response, their brains had abundant energy to consume for sustained, high-level executive function.
Which brings us to the ultimate reckoning, the bottom line. We have mapped the invisible landscape of stress, the cortisol pathways, the cold sweats, the fNIRS lasers reading oxygen in the prefrontal cortex. But at the end of the day, this was an academic examination.
Yes, there were grades involved.
Did this profound biological difference actually translate to the grades written on the clipboards of the clinical assessors?
The clinical performance scores provide the ultimate, irrefutable validation of the physiological data.
The assessors, who, remember, were blinded to the cognitive appraisal state of the students, graded their clinical interventions on a scale of 1 to 10. And the gap between the two groups is just staggering.
It really is.
In both settings, Scenario 1 and Scenario 2, the challenge group performed, on average, 17% better clinically than the threat group.
A 17% difference in clinical performance is the difference between passing and failing. It is quite literally, in the real world, the difference between a patient surviving and a patient dying.
Wow. Let's look at the specific score breakdown.
Sure. In Scenario 1, the threat group averaged a failing score of 4.15 out of 10. The challenge group averaged a 4.85.
In Scenario 2, both groups improved, which makes sense. I mean, they're getting used to the specific testing environment of the lab. The threat group moved up to a 6.36.
But the challenge group surged to a 7.08. Yes, there was a main effect of improvement for the scenario iteration overall, p less than 0.01, but the threat group was perpetually lagging behind. The structural limitations imposed by their stress response meant their absolute ceiling was effectively the challenge group's floor.
When you synthesize all of this, the message is incredibly clear, and I want to read a direct quote from the paper because it brings it all home perfectly. Quote, "Participants who approached the simulated OSCE with a challenge-oriented mindset demonstrated more regulated cardiovascular and cerebral stress responses and achieved significantly higher scores on clinical performance measures."
It proves that mindset is not some soft psychological buzzword. It is a hard biological lever that directly throttles your competence.
The researchers make a really brilliant observation about the dose dependency of stress in the discussion section. They note, and I quote again, "We propose that moderate stress can enhance cognitive functioning and serve as a motivational catalyst for improved performance. But once stress surpasses manageable levels, it appears to maintain an almost linear relationship with deteriorating clinical performance."
An almost linear relationship with deteriorating clinical performance. It is a very sobering conclusion.
It really is.
It means that once you cross that threshold from challenge to threat, every single incremental increase in your perceived panic directly erodes a percentage point of your actual capability. The cortisol floods the system, your brain either hyperactivates chaotically or shuts down entirely due to cognitive overload, and your performance just plummets.
And this is exactly why this deep dive matters so intensely to you, the listener.
Absolutely.
The subjects of this study were 24-year-old paramedicine students treating plastic mannequins. But the biological hardware they're using is the exact same hardware inside your head right now.
The very same.
Whether you are walking into a courtroom, stepping onto a stage to give a keynote address, or sitting down to take the bar exam, the mechanics of cognitive appraisal are universally applicable.
If you approach a high-stakes environment and subconsciously appraise it as a threat, if your internal dialogue focuses on inadequacy and anticipated failure, you are actively orchestrating a physiological cascade that will starve your prefrontal cortex of the oxygen it needs to help you succeed.
You are doing it to yourself.
Yeah, you're inducing the cold sweat, spiking your heart rate, and barricading yourself from your own intelligence before you even begin the task.
Let's quickly summarize the incredible landscape we have traversed today. We began with Lazarus and Folkman's foundational cognitive appraisal theory, understanding that stress is merely an evaluation of our perceived resources against our perceived demands.
Right.
We explored how Jason Betson's 2025 study utilized rigorous controls mandating high GPAs and zero CNS-altering medications to isolate this mindset during grueling 30-minute medical simulations.
And we charted the profound physiological consequences of a threat appraisal. The massive, statistically significant surge in salivary cortisol via the HPA axis, the sustained tachycardia, and the peripheral vasoconstriction that pulled blood away from the skin, resulting in a literal cold sweat.
And through the marvel of fNIRS technology, we peered right through the skulls of these students to map their regional neural activation. We witnessed the threat group's prefrontal cortex chaotically overfire in the first scenario, redlining the engine without moving forward.
Spinning the wheels.
Yeah. And we watched that same neural network succumb to cognitive overload and flatline in the second scenario, just refusing to draw the oxygen required for complex, sustained problem solving, all of which culminated in a massive 17% deficit in their clinical performance.
Which leaves us with a compelling final thought. The rigorous neurological data definitively proves that perceiving a stressor as a threat structurally limits your brain's endurance and executive function. However, cognitive appraisals are inherently subjective. The challenge group successfully maintained an optimal biological state simply by perceiving their resources as adequate.
They tricked their own biology into peak performance.
Precisely. So the provocative question we leave you with is this. Knowing that this appraisal is entirely subjective, what specific mental frameworks, environmental cues, or deliberate daily habits can you design in your own life to artificially force a challenge appraisal right before your next high-stakes moment?
I love that.
How can you train your mind to look at the steep hill ahead, calmly shift gears, and supply your brain with the exact resources it needs to conquer the climb?
That really is the ultimate test of executive function. How do you rewrite the mathematical equation of stress in your own head? We will leave you to ponder that vital question.
Thank you so much for joining us on this extensive deep dive into the hidden physiological realities of stress and cognitive performance.
It's been a great conversation.
It really has. We have thoroughly enjoyed unpacking this remarkable source material with you. Until next time, stay challenged, keep your engine running smoothly, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.